The question came 17 minutes into the broadcast. The host, a smooth-talking veteran of late-night television, had been moving through the usual topics: new albums, upcoming tours, stories from the road. Johnny Cash sat on the couch to the left, dressed in black as always, his posture relaxed but attentive. Glen Campbell sat to the right, sharper dressed, younger, carrying the confidence of someone whose career was ascending fast. The show was live, taped before a studio audience in Los Angeles, broadcast across the country in early 1971. The kind of program where careers could be made or damaged in a single unscripted moment. "Gentlemen," the host said, leaning forward with that practiced curiosity, "there's been a lot of talk lately about authenticity in country music, about who represents the real heart of the genre. If you had to name the most authentic country artist working today, who would it be?" It was the kind of question designed to create conversation, safe enough to answer diplomatically, dangerous enough to get interesting. The host looked at Glenn first. Glenn smiled, the kind of smile that said he knew exactly where this was going. "Well," Glenn said, glancing at the audience, "I think there are a lot of authentic voices out there. Merle, Willie, Waylon. But if we're talking about the image people associate with real country, with that outlaw edge, I think most folks would say John here." The audience murmured approval. A few people clapped. Cash nodded slightly, acknowledging the compliment but not embracing it. The host turned to Cash. "John, what do you think? Do you see yourself as the authentic voice Glenn's describing?" Cash took a moment before answering. "I think authenticity is about being honest with the people who listen to you. Whether that makes me the voice or just one voice, I don't know." It was a measured answer, the kind Cash always gave, thoughtful, humble enough to deflect attention, but confident enough to hold the room. Glenn shifted in his seat. Something in his expression changed. Not anger exactly, but something sharper. "Can I say something?" Glenn asked, not waiting for permission. His tone was still light, still conversational, but there was an edge underneath it now. The host gestured for him to continue. Glenn looked at Cash, then at the audience, then back at Cash. "Let's be honest," Glenn said. "John never broke the law. He just visits people who did. That's not being an outlaw, that's being a tourist." The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from anticipation, the kind that comes from shock. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. The camera stayed on Glenn for a moment, then cut to Cash, and Johnny Cash, sitting there in his black suit, didn't move. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The host opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but nothing came out. Glenn's smile had frozen on his face, like he was suddenly realizing what he just said on live television. And Cash just sat there, quiet, still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes on Glenn. The silence stretched so long it became uncomfortable. People in the audience shifted. Someone coughed. The host looked down at his notes like they might have an answer. Finally, Cash spoke. His voice was calm. No anger, no defensiveness, just steady. "You're right, Glenn." Glenn blinked. That wasn't the response he'd expected. Cash continued, his eyes never leaving Glenn's face. "I never went to prison, but I went to the men inside. You went to the sponsors. We both performed, but for different audiences." The room stayed silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not shock, something heavier, something that felt like recognition. Glenn's smile disappeared completely. He looked down at the glass of water on the table in front of him. His hand moved toward it, then stopped. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at it. Some truths don't need to be loud to leave a mark. The host cleared his throat. "Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective from both of you. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back." The cameras pulled back. The theme music started. And for a moment before the feed cut to commercial, you could see Glen Campbell still staring at that glass of water, his face completely unreadable. When the show came back from commercial, the host had pivoted to safer ground. He asked about new music, about families, about anything that didn't involve who was authentic and who wasn't. Glen answered when spoken to, but his responses were shorter now, clipped. Cash continued as he always did, thoughtful and measured, like nothing had happened. But something had happened, and everyone watching knew it. After the show, Glen left quickly. No backstage pleasantries, no mingling with the crew. He was in his car and gone before most of the audience had even filed out of the studio. Cash stayed longer. He talked to a few people, signed some autographs, thanked the host. But when someone asked him about Glen's comment, Cash just shook his head. "Glen's a talented man," Cash said. "One of the best guitarists I've ever heard. I wish him well." That was all he said, and he never spoke about it publicly again. But Glen Campbell spoke about it, or rather, he didn't, and that absence became its own kind of statement. In the weeks following the broadcast, reporters tried to get Glen to comment. They'd ask him about Johnny Cash, about the Outlaw movement, about what he'd said on that show, and every time Glen would give the same answer: no comment. Not defensive, not apologetic, just no comment. Years later, a journalist managed to corner Glen at a party and asked him directly, "Why did you say that about Johnny Cash on live television?" Glen looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I was jealous." The journalist waited for more, but Glen didn't elaborate. He just walked away. That moment on television became one of those stories people told when they talked about the difference between popularity and respect. Glen Campbell was more popular than Johnny Cash in 1971. His records sold better. His television variety show had higher ratings. He was the bigger star by every commercial measure. But after that night, something shifted. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, the way reputations shift when people start to see someone differently. Glen's career didn't end. He continued to have hits. He continued to tour. But the momentum he'd had, that sense of ascending inevitability, slowed, and some people in the industry started to see him differently. Not as the authentic voice of country music, but as the polished one, the commercial one, the one who performed for sponsors. And whether that was fair or not didn't matter, because once that perception takes hold, it's almost impossible to shake. Johnny Cash's career, meanwhile, continued on its own trajectory, not always upward. He had his struggles, his setbacks, his periods in the wilderness, but through it all, there was one thing people never questioned: his authenticity, his connection to the people he sang about, his willingness to go to the places others avoided. The irony was that Glen had been right in a technical sense. Cash had never broken the law in any serious way. He'd never done time in prison. His outlaw image was, in some ways, constructed, performed. But what Glen missed, what he didn't understand until it was too late, was that authenticity isn't about whether you lived the exact life you sing about. It's about whether you honor the people who did, whether you use your platform to remember the forgotten or to sell to the comfortable. Cash went to prisons not because he'd been an inmate, but because he refused to let inmates be invisible. He wore black not because he was a criminal, but because he wanted to stand in solidarity with people society had written off. Glen performed for audiences who could afford tickets. Cash performed for people who couldn't. And in that difference, in that choice of who you perform for and why, lies the real measure of authenticity. In 1985, 14 years after that television appearance, Glen Campbell was doing an interview for a music magazine. The journalist asked him about regrets. Glen thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "I said something once on live television that I wish I could take back. Not because it wasn't true in a literal sense, but because it missed the point entirely." "What did you say?" Glen shook his head. "It doesn't matter anymore. The person I said it to never held it against me, but I held it against myself." Did you apologize? I tried, Glenn said quietly. He told me there was nothing to apologize for, that we were both just doing what we thought was right at the time. But I knew better. I knew what I was doing when I said it. What were you doing? Glenn looked out the window. I was trying to diminish someone I couldn't compete with. And the worst part is, I didn't even realize we weren't competing. The journalist didn't understand. What do you mean? I mean that John and I were playing different games. I was trying to be the most successful. He was trying to be the most honest. And I mistook his game for mine. Glenn paused. That's a mistake you can't undo. You can only live with it. Johnny Cash never mentioned Glen Campbell's name in interviews unless asked directly, and when asked, he always said the same thing. Glen's a tremendous talent. I've always respected his musicianship. No mention of the television show, no mention of the comment, just respect for the talent, and a quiet refusal to engage with the conflict. But people who knew Cash well said that the moment on that show had affected him more than he let on. Not because it hurt his feelings or damaged his reputation, but because it made him think about what he represented and why it mattered. After that night, Cash became even more intentional about his prison concerts, even more careful about who he sang for and why. He'd been doing it before, but now there was a sharper sense of purpose, a recognition that his authenticity wasn't something he could assume, it was something he had to earn over and over, by showing up for the people who needed him most. In his later years, when Cash recorded the American Recordings albums, he returned to that same principle, stripped down, honest, focused not on what would sell, but on what was true. And those albums, recorded when he was old and sick and past his commercial prime, became some of the most respected work of his career. Because authenticity isn't about success, it's about consistency. It's about still being yourself when there's no commercial reason to be. Glen Campbell had a good career, a successful career. He sold millions of records, he entertained millions of people. He was talented, charismatic, and professional. But when people talk about Glen Campbell, they talk about Rhinestone Cowboy and Wichita Lineman. Great songs, iconic performances. When people talk about Johnny Cash, they talk about what he stood for. And in the end, that's the difference Glen saw too late. The television show Where It All Happened became a piece of country music lore. Some people remember it as the time Glen Campbell tried to take down Johnny Cash and failed. Others remember it as the moment two different philosophies of country music collided on live television. But the truth, like most truths, is simpler. Glen Campbell said something he thought was clever. Johnny Cash responded with something that was true, and the audience, the industry, and eventually Glen himself recognized which one mattered more. Not because Cash was a better person, not because Glen was wrong to be ambitious or commercial or successful, but because when you're on live television and someone questions your authenticity, you have two choices. You can defend yourself with words, or you can prove it with your life. Johnny Cash had already proven it. He didn't need to defend it. And Glen Campbell, sitting there staring at his glass of water, realized that in real time, on live television, in front of millions of people. Some lessons are learned in private. Others are learned in front of the whole world. Glen Campbell's learned his in front of cameras, and he spent the rest of his career trying to live with it. Not because Johnny Cash held it against him, but because he held it against himself. And that, more than anything else, is what ended his momentum. Not the comment, not Cash's response, but the recognition, slow and inevitable, that he'd attacked something he didn't understand, and by the time he understood it, it was too late to take it back. Years later, someone asked what Glen Campbell's biggest regret was. The person who answered wasn't Glen. It was someone who'd known him well. He never said it out loud, the person said, but I think it was that moment with Johnny Cash, not because of what it did to his career, but because of what it revealed about him.
And once you see something like that about yourself, you can't unsee it. Johnny Cash went to the men inside. Glen Campbell went to the sponsors. Both performed, but only one of them stayed connected to the people who needed the performance most. And on a television show in 1971, in front of a live audience and millions of viewers, that difference became impossible to ignore.